everyone, I'm Brandy and welcome back to True Crime and Felines. Every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of 14 of my felines. This week's case is going to be a mystery. It has to deal with 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey, and the strange letters that arrived at that house from the Watcher. So let's get started. So in June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus had finally bought their dream home, and it would be the house of 657 Boulevard. This house was beautiful. It was 3,900 square feet. It had 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, hardwood floors, wraparound porch, just the most gorgeous house on the block. Derek worked at an insurance company and he had worked his way up to senior vice president. Maria was actually raised in Westfield and loved the community, so she was happy to come back to her hometown. They had 3 children, ages 5, 8, and 10. Now, they bought this house for $1.3 million right after Derek's 40th birthday. Their 3 kids were very excited as they ran through the house, picking their rooms and discussing which fireplace in the house Santa would come down. Now, before moving in, Derek and Maria actually wanted to do some renovations to the place. So they hired some contractors and started in on it. 3 days after they closed on the house, Derek was over there painting and he just went out and checked the mail for the first time. There was a letter with no return address, and it was addressed to the new owner. The letter was mailed, it just wasn't slipped in the box because it had a stamp and it had been processed through the local post office. The letter started out innocent enough, welcoming the family to the neighborhood, but then it took a turn. The letter stated, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now as it approaches its 110th birthday. I have been in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s and my father watched it in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. Did you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. Was your old house too small for your growing family? Or was it greed to bring me your children? Once I know their names, I will call them and draw them to me. I asked the woods to bring me young blood, and it looks like they listened." So obviously getting a letter like this would jar you a little bit. I mean, after all, the person was talking about his children, and it was signed the Watcher. Derek would run back to the house, turn off all the lights in the house, and he ended up calling the police. When the deputy came out to look at the letter, he kind of dismissed it a little bit. They really just told Derek they shouldn't worry too much. It was probably just some kids playing a prank. So Derek continued with the renovations on the house. Now, as time would go on, 3 more letters would arrive a month apart. One in June, one in July, and one in August. Altogether, the letters stated, 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of this house. Have you found all the secrets it holds yet? I'm pleased to know your names now and the names of the young blood you brought me. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. I notice one of your children using an easel. Is she the artist of the family? Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid? I would be afraid, as it's far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Derek would end up showing all of these to the police again. The police started taking it more seriously and would ask Derek, do you have any enemies? Do you have anybody that's mad at you? You were kind of in a bidding war on this house. Is there maybe somebody that's mad that you beat them, that you bought the house and they couldn't? And Derek had no names to come up with. So the police just recommended that Derek put any construction equipment kind of away or behind the house or in the garage, so nobody could really damage the property with it. They also told him not to say anything to his neighbors because obviously they were all suspects and the police were going to do an investigation. Now, the last letter had mentioned the Woods, which was the previous owners of 657 Boulevard. Their names were Andrea and John. They were contacted by the police and notified of the letters. The police asked them if they ever received anything from the watcher or any weird letters at all because they lived in the house for 20 years before they moved out. Now, Andrea stated that they did receive a letter right before they actually moved out. She said the letter was more odd than threatening and mentioned that they were watching the house but only thanked them for taking great care of the house. And they ended up just throwing the letter away because they didn't think anything of it. Before the Woods moved into the house, the Bakes lived in the house for over 40 years. And they were contacted and they said they never got any such letters or anything like that in the time that they were living there. The next couple weeks, Derek and Maria were obviously on high alert. Anytime they would come to the house to check on the renovations or do a little renovation themselves, they would make their kids stay pretty close to them. If they got too close to the property line, they'd yell at them to come back. They also really paid attention to anyone walking by the house that may seem suspicious. Now, because the house was very elaborate on the block and the renovations were going through, a lot of neighbors would stop by just to say hi. On one such occasion, Derek decided to give a tour to this neighbor couple, showing them the renovations that were being done in the house. They lived on the block, not necessarily next door, but, were interested in what was going on and wanted to introduce themselves to Derek and Maria. So while they were on this tour in the house, Maria said her blood ran cold when the wife of the couple said, "It'll be nice to have some young blood in the neighborhood." Things were happening in the house as well. The contractors that were working on the house had noticed some things. One morning, the contractor arrived and he had hammered a very big metal sign into the ground, saying that his company is the one working on the house. And it had been ripped out overnight, which could not be done by one person, as it was a very heavy sign. At that point, Derek and Maria stopped taking their kids to the house. They just were too afraid that something was going to happen to them, and they were on edge. Another letter would arrive a couple weeks later of the kids not being at the house, and it said, "Where have you gone? 657 Boulevard is missing you. You have changed it and made it so fancy. You are stealing its history. It cries for the past." So it's important to know a little bit about the town of Westfield, New Jersey. The residents who live there actually compare it to Mayberry, which was the setting for the Andy Griffith Show.
The Andy Griffith Show.
They're very proud of their town. It's made up of mostly families, and there's very little crime or issues. For example, at the time that this was going on, the biggest issues was that Trader Joe's was closed temporarily because the roof had collapsed, and there was some aggressive parking enforcement going on. So if that's the worst that could happen in a town, I mean, you can imagine there's very little crime going on. Now, this town is known for being a little upscale. And so when a house goes up for sale there, it's sold very quickly. Some neighbors had stated that when a house goes up for sale, bidding wars can start, and they could be upped by 300 grand or more above the asking price. This is especially true for 657 Boulevard. It was built in 1905, and the house was the grandest on the block. When the Woods put it up for sale, they immediately received several offers at asking price. So Derek thought about it more and thought maybe that whoever's writing these letters could be somebody upset that they outbid them on the house. However, when Derek and the police talked to the Woods a little bit more, the Woods had stated that there were two buyers that were asking more than what Derek and Maria were asking. And what had happened is the first buyer had backed out because they had got bad news about a bad medical diagnosis. And the only other one actually had bought another house while waiting for an answer from the Woods. So they backed out of the sale also, and that's how it landed in Derek and Maria's lap. So the police kind of looked elsewhere, and they thought it had to be somebody local because they knew things about the house, and especially things that weren't necessarily made public. For example, when the Woods put the house up for sale, they didn't put a for sale sign in the yard. And the first letter was mailed before the sale was actually made public. So that was a little odd. So the police started focusing mainly on the neighbors and the proximity of the neighborhood. The easel that was mentioned that Maria and Derek's daughter was using was actually hidden from the street out front. So unless someone was behind the house or exactly next door, they wouldn't even be able to see the easel. Derek and Maria tried to, brush this aside, and they ended up attending a barbecue across the street at one of their neighbor's house. Now, remember, the police told Derek that they can't say anything to the neighbors, so they didn't know about these letters at all. Now, one of the residents at the barbecue told Derek about the Langford family. Now, the Langford family actually lived right next door to 657 Boulevard. The matriarch of the family, Peggy Langford, was in her 90s, and several of her children that were in their 60s still lived with her. And the way the house was positioned, they could look right in on the back porch and see the easel. Now, according to the letters, the watcher stated that his father watched the house for years, and the family had lived there since the 1960s. The Langfords had lived in that house for over 40 years. The letter also inquired that once their father died, that the watcher took over his father's stead and was watching the house for the better part of 2 decades. Well, Richard Langford, who was the patriarch of the family, had died 12 years earlier. So the pieces seem to sort of go together that maybe one of Peggy's children, or Peggy, was writing these letters. So Derek would go to the police and tell them all this information, and an investigation was formally started. Now, they put 2 and 2 together, and the next door neighbors of the Langfords, a specific Michael Langford, who was Peggy's son, was the primary suspect. So it came out that Michael had schizophrenia, but his family would severely defend him and say that he's not capable of writing letters like this. They were still watching the Langford family, but they were looking elsewhere as well. Now, one of the contractors working on the renovations of the house would actually talk to police and tell them about the sign being pulled out, but they also said that there's neighbors that are directly behind the 657 Boulevard, and they had 2 lawn chairs set up in their backyard, which is fairly normal. But he said that the chairs were actually facing looking at 657 Boulevard, and they were pretty close to the property line, and he found that sort of odd. Those neighbors were looked at and ruled out. Now, the U.S. Postal Service actually helped all they could to, try to determine and help the authorities figure out who is sending these letters. But they can't determine where the letters are being dropped off, whether they're being dropped off directly at the post office, in a public mailbox. So there wasn't much that the U.S. Postal Service could do either. So they ended up actually taking one of the letters and doing a DNA analysis on the envelope. So as you can imagine, they lick the envelope and they're able to get DNA off of that. And what they determined is that it was actually a woman who had licked and closed the envelope. But it didn't match anyone in the Langford home. So they were pretty much all ruled out at this point. The police were kind of at a dead end, and they ended up telling Derek and Maria that there wasn't much they can do short of somebody coming out and confessing to writing these letters. They also told Derek and Maria that probably nothing will happen, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Derek obviously wasn't satisfied with that, so he had a friend who actually was in the FBI and pulled them in to help. So the FBI looked at the letters and did some analysis and determined that whoever was writing these letters was older because the letters were typed, and they would use 2 spaces at the end of a period, which some of you may be too young to remember this, but back when, typing class, we actually used typewriters. That was the thing to do, is that when you ended a sentence, you had 2 spaces before you started a new sentence instead of the 1 space. They also said based on their vocabulary and just the way the letter was done, that it had to be an older person. Now, this FBI person stated that ultimately the letter writer was deemed not overly threatening, but was also unpredictable. Handwriting analysis was done because the front of the envelope was actually handwritten, and they did handwriting analysis and tried to compare it to, Christmas cards that the family was getting, and they never found anybody that matched that either. They also hired someone to scour the local online forums to see if somebody used similar language in those forums to see if they could find a match, but nothing came of that either. Now, Derek was getting very, very desperate, and he had a friend he worked with that was kind of a tech guru, and he went to that friend and they had a discussion about if it was possible to hack into all the local Wi-Fis around the neighborhood and try to look for any incriminating documents on these people's computers. Now, obviously, that is highly illegal, and actually hacking into a Wi-Fi network to get into a computer is way more difficult than the movies make it. So they ended up not doing anything like that. Now, as they were investigating this, the house was being watched by the authorities, and they were looking for anyone who may be looking in the windows or whatever. And one night, as they were watching the house, they noticed a car parked out front of the house that was there for what they felt was too long. So they went and questioned the individual. It ended up being a woman, and she was actually the girlfriend of a neighbor. So she was waiting for the neighbor to come out of the house. And so she wasn't actually she didn't mean to park in front of 657 Boulevard. She just parked there because she was waiting for her boyfriend to come out so they could leave. They wanted to talk to this couple a little bit more, so they ended up making an appointment, and the girlfriend came into the police station. Now, she did state that her boyfriend was into some pretty dark video games, but what she said is there was a particular character that her boyfriend played called the Watcher. So the police decided they need to talk to this boyfriend. So 2 interviews would be scheduled with his boyfriend, and he would not show up to either one. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to force the guy to come in for an interview, and they were also stating that since it's a woman's DNA on the envelope and it didn't match this woman that they were interviewing, they thought it was just a coincidence. So they ended up dropping that part of the investigation and moving on, which I find strange. He didn't show up twice, but you're just going to drop it? So they went down all these roads trying to figure out what is going on, who's sending the letters, and they're just coming up with nothing at this point. So at the end of the day, Maria just said, "What are you willing to risk? We aren't going to put our kids in harm's way." So they decided they were not going to move into the house. So Derek and Maria actually had sold the house they were currently living in and needed to get out. So they ended up moving in with Maria's parents, who lived in Westfield. The renovations had been finished, and they actually put in an alarm system as well. Derek stated that the alarm system would go off several times during the middle of the night, and he would go to the house and nothing would be there. It literally was their joy and happiness of buying this dream house had turned into a complete nightmare. So 6 months after they bought the house, they put the house on the market. They were asking for a bit more than they paid for it due to the renovations. However, they had to disclose the watcher's letters that they received because a police report had been filed. So any potential buyers that would put offers in on the house after they were shown the letters, they walked away. They didn't want anything to do with it. So after offer after offer after offer was falling through and potential buyers were walking away, Derek and Maria were getting pretty mad about this. So they actually filed a lawsuit against the Woodses, who lived in the house before them for 20 years, citing that they didn't disclose the letter they received, and that if they'd known that this letter was received by the Woodses, they may not have bought the house either. However, the case was thrown out because they stated that the Woods just threw the letter out and never filed a police report, so they didn't have to disclose the letter. Plus, if they stated that they had to disclose a letter like that, it would set an unreasonable precedent on what sellers would have to disclose before a house is bought. Now, this suit that they filed became public, and that's when all the neighborhood found out about the letters and the watcher. Now, at this point, it had been over a year, and no more letters had been received. But the public, just now finding out about it, wanted to talk about it at a city council. So the community was informed at this city council meeting that there was no more letters that had received in a year, that not to worry about it, and that they have done an exhaustive investigation. However, several of the 657 Boulevard's neighbors were surprised about that because they said, "We knew nothing about this, nor did any police talk to us." So then it makes you wonder how much of an investigation was actually done. The more this went on, several of the community members actually started blaming Derek and Maria, stating that they made this whole thing up and sent letters to themselves, that they realized that they were over their head in buying this house and found out they couldn't afford it, so they were trying to get out of it now. One resident would state to a local paper, "How did the couple go from a $300,000 house to a $700,000 house to a $1.3 million house in 10 years? Derek simply responded, "It's America." But you also have to remember, Maria's parents had lived in this area for years, and Maria grew up in this town. And how Maria put it is this town was pretty idyllic. You'd rather victim blame, than believe that there's something sinister going on in the town. The town already was sort of famous for John List. He would murder his entire family. So the townsfolk didn't want to further ruin the town's name by now being known as not only the John List Massacre, but the Watcher as well. Remember, they compared their town to Mayberry. So the house had been on the market now since 2014. It's now 2017. The house is still not sold. So Derek and Maria made an effort to have the house actually torn down and turn the lot into 2 development lots. So they submitted this request to the city of Westfield, and after a 4-hour city council meeting, their plans were denied. So next, the family actually asked for some tax relief. They had paid over $100,000 since 2014 in property taxes because they still had to pay a mortgage and everything because the thing isn't sold, right? Again, the city denied them, stating that the police spent at least that much on the investigation of the watcher. It almost feels like a conspiracy at this point, right? Derek and Maria were kind of at a loss. They really didn't know what to do. They were too scared to move into the house because of their children, and they really could not afford this house and its payments anymore because they had actually bought another house in Westfield. They were kind of at their wits' end on what to do. But finally, this family kind of came forward, and they had grown children and 2 giant dogs as part of their family, and they stated they're willing to rent the house and they weren't concerned about any letters that they may get. But to be safe, there was still a clause in the rental agreement that they could pull out of that house at any time just in case things got weird. So Derek and Maria rented the house to this family. 2 weeks after the family moved into the house, the renter gave Derek a letter. The letter on the front was addressed to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench wife, Maria. It had been 2.5 years since they received the last letter, and then all of a sudden they get this letter, and it stated, "You wonder who the watcher is? Turn around, idiots. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break." So the letter seemed to now be threatening them, that if they tried to destroy the house, something may happen to them or their family. The renters did agree to stay. After years on the market, the house finally sold in 2019. It sold for a $400,000 loss, but Derek and Maria were glad to see it go. Derek and Maria did end up buying another house in Westfield because they did not want to uproot their kids, but they bought it under a LLC in order to stay private. So Derek and Maria had to let go of their dream house, but they did end up living in Westfield, New Jersey, and nothing has reportedly happened. No letters have been received. But don't feel too bad for them. Netflix actually bought the rights to their creepy story after a bidding war between Universal, Warner Brothers, and Fox. So I'm sure they more than made up for what they lost in the house. Nobody ever to this day has figured out who the watcher was. The new family living in the house has stated they have received no letters. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on this? Was this just a silly prank? Was there really a watcher? Was there some secret to the house and in its walls? Would you leave your dream home if you received letters like this? I mean, I can say, the home I'm living in now, me and my husband built, and I love it. It is my dream home. If I received letters, it probably wouldn't have pushed me out of the house. But I don't have kids either, so I can't say if I had children, I might think differently. What are your comments? I'd love to read them down below. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will be back next Friday with the Felines and another true crime case or mystery. Thanks, guys. See ya.